Wife claims she volunteered at church all day. So I followed her to the church and found out she is cheating on me with her school BF and she's pregnant with his baby. I will start this by saying that my mother has always deeply desired to have a daughter. This was something she had dreamt of for as long as I can remember. Her excitement was palpable when she and my father discovered they were expecting their first child, which happened to be me. However, everything changed the moment she learned I was going to be a boy. She was extremely disappointed, and this disappointment wasn't something she kept to herself. In fact, she has recounted this story to me on numerous occasions throughout my life, making it clear that she had always wished for a different outcome. My parents did plan to have more children since my mother in particular had her heart set on having a daughter. Unfortunately, life had other plans. After I was born, my mother started experiencing severe health complications, which over the years, made it impossible for her to carry another child. The idea of never being able to conceive again was devastating for her. I can only imagine the emotional weight of that loss, and it's one I think she still carries to this day. It must have been an incredibly painful realization for her that the dream of having a daughter would never come true. In the years that followed, my mother would often speak about her yearning for a daughter, a sentiment that seemed to intensify as time went on. I would notice how she doted on my female cousins, lavishing them with affection and attention that felt like an expression of the maternal love she had always hoped to give a daughter of her own. Whether it was through extra gifts, affection, or simply the way she treated them, there was a clear difference in how she related to them compared to me. Oddly enough, this behavior of hers didn't really bother me for much of my life. I had accepted that this was just who my mother was, and I didn't take her favoritism towards my female cousins personally. I knew she loved me, and for the most part, I was at peace with it. That is, until my ex-wife, Sophia, entered the picture. Sophia was the daughter of my mother's long-lost best friend from high school, someone my mother had reconnected with after many years of being out of touch. When my mother met Sophia for the first time, she was taken aback by how beautiful she was and instantly became fixated on the idea that Sophia would be the perfect match for me. At that time, I was single, and my mother had been somewhat relentless in her efforts to set me up with various women, but none of those attempts really stuck. This time, however, she was determined and persistent. She kept telling me how stunning and wonderful Sophia was, how much we'd complement each other, and eventually, it became almost an obsession for her. For weeks, I endured her constant attempts to push us together, and eventually, I caved. Honestly, at that point, I agreed to the blind date more out of a desire to quiet my mother than out of any real curiosity or interest. I just wanted her to stop talking about Sophia and let me go about my life. When I finally met Sophia, my first impression matched everything my mother had told me she was, without a doubt, incredibly beautiful. But as the evening progressed and we got to know each other a little better, I realized there wasn't much substance beneath her beauty. One of the first things I always try to learn about someone is what drives them, what their goals are, and what dreams they have for their future. When I asked Sophia what she wanted to do with her life, her answer surprised me. She told me, without hesitation, that her dream was to be a stay-at-home mom. That's when I felt a sense of disconnect. It's not that there's anything wrong with wanting to raise a family, but at that point in my life, I had very different ambitions. I wasn't even thinking about having children anytime soon, and I expected to be with someone who had aspirations beyond just starting a family. So, naturally, I asked her what she planned to do in the meantime before she had children, and her response left me even more perplexed. She simply replied that she just wanted to be a stay-at-home wife. I looked at her perplexed as she went on to explain that her mother had always been a stay-at-home mom for as long as she could remember, up until her dad passed away, and that, in her eyes, this was the secret to her parents' successful marriage. While I could respect that it worked for her family, it felt completely different from what I was looking for in a partner. I wanted someone with passion, someone driven by a sense of purpose, whether in a career or a personal pursuit. The idea of someone wanting to be a stay-at-home spouse from the start didn't align with my values. At the time, Sophia and her mom were living with their uncle, who was covering all their expenses since her mother still didn't want to work. When I came back from that first date with Sophia, I was undeniably disappointed. I had gone into the date with low expectations, mostly because I wanted to appease my mother, but coming out of it, I knew this wasn't what I was looking for. Naturally, my mother wasn't too pleased when I shared my thoughts. In fact, she was visibly upset, almost as if I had personally wronged her by not giving Sophia what she considered to be a real chance. She kept telling me that I hadn't taken the time to truly get to know Sophia, insisting that if I just tried a little harder, I would see what she saw. But I had made up my mind. I told her, as firmly as I could, to let the idea of us go, and that it was best if we both moved on. I should have known better, though. My mother was not someone who gave up easily, especially when she had her heart set on something, or in this case, someone. Not too long after that, my mother invited me over to her house, which wasn't unusual. She would often ask me to come by for dinner or just to catch up. But this time, when I arrived, I noticed that Sophia was there as well. Apparently, my mother had taken it upon herself to invite Sophia over too, so she could force another meeting between us. Once I arrived, both my mother and father hurried out of the house, with almost mischievous smiles, saying, "Enjoy your date." I was absolutely mortified. Judging by Sophia's reaction, I'm sure she felt the same. We stood there for a moment, awkwardly looking at each other, neither of us knowing quite what to say or how to handle the situation. It was like being set up on a date you hadn't agreed to, right in the middle of my own parents' home, with no escape in sight. For a few minutes, we just stood there in silence, unsure of what to do. I could have easily made an excuse and left, but I didn't want to embarrass her further. After all, she was as much a victim of my mother's overzealous matchmaking as I was. So, instead of bolting, we both exchanged awkward laughs, acknowledging how bizarre the situation was, and eventually sat down to talk. I figured, since we were already there and had nothing better to do, I might as well ask her to tell me more about herself. She admitted, rather openly, that she had liked me after our first date and was under the impression that I had liked her too. But then, when I never called her back or made any effort to reach out, she was left feeling confused. I told her, as gently as I could, that while she was indeed a kind and beautiful person, I felt like we had very different goals in life since she desired to be a stay-at-home wife. Sophia then explained to me that her intention wasn't to just sit around the house doing nothing, even if we didn't have children right away. She started to talk more about her volunteer work at the church, and how she dedicated her days to working with children and helping those in need. Her explanation gave me a new perspective. I started to see another side of Sophia, one that I hadn't fully appreciated before. I realized that, at her core, Sophia seemed to be a genuinely warm and kind person, or at least that's how she portrayed herself to me initially. Although she wasn't exactly driven by career ambitions or lofty personal goals, she seemed to have found her purpose in caring for others, and that level of generosity of spirit is rare. So, despite the reservations I had and the lingering doubts about our compatibility, I decided to take a leap and ask her out on another date. Sophia and I ended up dating for about a year before we decided to take the next step and get engaged. I had also been promoted at work during this period, which significantly boosted my income and gave me a sense of stability. I felt financially comfortable enough to support Sophia once we got married, which gave me the confidence to propose to her. However, the timing of the proposal wasn't entirely my decision alone. Both our mothers, particularly mine, had been subtly pushing for us to get married sooner rather than later. They kept reminding us that Sophia's biological clock was ticking, even though neither of us had immediate plans to start a family. But the pressure from them was ever present, and their insistence made me think that getting married sooner was the natural next step. When we finally got engaged, my mother, true to her nature, took charge of the wedding planning. She insisted on having a grand ceremony, sparing no expense, and offered to pay for the entire event herself. My mother was determined to make Sophia's dream wedding come true as if it were her own daughter's wedding, a gesture that was both generous and somewhat overwhelming. From the venue to the flowers to the guest list, no detail was too small for her to obsess over. The ceremony ended up being incredibly lavish, much grander than I had anticipated, but seeing how happy Sophia was made it all worthwhile. After the wedding and the honeymoon, I quickly resumed my routine at work, diving back into my job, which was more demanding than ever due to my recent promotion. Meanwhile, Sophia moved into my place, and just as we had discussed before, she began to fully embrace her role as a stay-at-home wife. She wasn't idle, though true to her word, she continued her volunteer work at a church in my locality, which she had always been passionate about. However, it wasn't long after we settled into married life that I started noticing some things about Sophia's routine that seemed off. Since we had never lived together before, I was learning all these little details about her day-to-day habits that I hadn't been aware of when we were dating. One thing that really stood out was how she regularly insisted that I send money to her mother every month. She'd argue that we had more than enough and that, as a good son-in-law, it was my duty to help support her mom. I found it odd, especially since this was never brought up before our marriage. I had always assumed her uncle took care of her mother's needs, but now, out of nowhere, I was expected to contribute financially. Secondly, Sophia would often go out and come back home really late in the evening. I expected that since she was a stay-at-home wife, she'd be at home more often, handling household things like cooking and cleaning during the day. But instead, she always seemed rushed when I got back from work, and would frantically start to cook dinner late in the evening. Whenever I asked about why she was coming home so late, she would tell me how she was helping someone, whether it was a homeless person she met or a kid from the community who needed some guidance. I didn't want to discourage her from doing what she felt was meaningful. But at the same time, I thought there was at least an understanding that as a homemaker, she would handle certain household responsibilities. This wasn't happening. Our meals were often late, or she'd throw something together at the last minute. The laundry was never done in time, and the house was rarely cleaned the way I thought it should be. I tried not to make a big deal out of it at first, but as time went on, I couldn't help but feel frustrated. I began bringing it up with her, having several calm conversations about how she could balance her volunteer work and her responsibilities at home. Each time, she promised me she'd change and do better, but the pattern never changed. It was always the same story: late dinners, chores left undone, and excuses about how busy she had been helping others. One weekend when she was, once again, out volunteering, I decided to go surprise her at the church where she said she volunteered. I thought maybe it would be nice to spend some time with her in her element, and I figured I could even lend her a hand if she needed help with anything. When I arrived at the church, I asked around for Sophia, expecting to find her in the middle of her volunteer work. However, the people at the church seemed confused when I mentioned her name, and after asking several people, it became clear that my wife had never volunteered there. In fact, no one knew who she was. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I processed this. For months after our marriage, Sophia had been telling me that she spent her days at this particular church volunteering, but now I was hearing that she hadn't even set foot in the place. I kept trying to convince myself that maybe I had made a mistake. Perhaps I had misunderstood the name of the church, or maybe she volunteered somewhere else nearby. Later that evening, when she came home, I decided to play it cool. I casually asked her how her day was, and she launched into her usual explanation of how hard she had worked that day, telling me in detail about all the people she had helped and the things she had accomplished. After she finished, I asked her directly what church she had been volunteering at, just to see if she'd give me the same answer. Sure enough, she repeated the name of the church I had visited earlier, the same one where I had been told she didn't work. That's when it became clear to me that something was seriously wrong. Sophia had been lying to me, not just once, but repeatedly, about where she was spending her time. It wasn't just a simple misunderstanding, she had been deliberately deceiving me, and I couldn't figure out why. What was she really doing all day? Why was she lying to me over and over again? Something was definitely up, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. The very next day, instead of heading to work as usual, I parked my car a few feet away from our house, far enough to stay out of sight but close enough to keep an eye on Sophia. I had made up my mind I was going to follow her and see where she spent her day. I wanted her to prove me wrong, to head to the church like she always said, and for this entire suspicion to be a misunderstanding. I was even mentally preparing myself to confess to her later, apologize for doubting her, and explain that I had let my insecurity get the best of me. But what unfolded next was something I could never have prepared for. An hour after I left the house, I saw her walk out the front door, but instead of the usual conservative clothes that she often wore around the house or around me, she was dressed completely differently in shorts and a tank top, an outfit I had never seen her wear before. I watched as she got into the car, and instead of driving in the direction of the church like I had expected, she took off in the opposite direction. My heart started racing. I followed her, staying a few cars behind to avoid raising suspicion. I kept telling myself that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe she was running an errand. Maybe she was meeting someone else from the church. Maybe. Eventually, she pulled into a quiet neighborhood and parked in front of a house I didn't recognize. It wasn't her mother's place, and it didn't belong to any of her cousins as far as I knew. I saw a man walk out of the house to greet her. My heart sank as I watched them embrace. And then, to my utter shock, they kissed in the driveway. They held each other, arms wrapped around one another like it was the most natural thing in the world for them. I couldn't breathe. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, except I was the one crashing, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as I tried to process what I had just seen. Sophia and the man then walked back inside the house, arms wrapped around each other, as if this was something they had done 100 times before. I felt sick. One thing seemed clear to me: this wasn't just a random fling or a one-time mistake. The way they interacted, the comfort between them, it was clear that this was a long-standing affair. My heart felt like it had been ripped out of my chest. All the doubts, the odd timings, the strange excuses, it all started to make sense now. She had been living a double life, lying to me about where she spent her time while carrying on this affair right under my nose. My first instinct was to call my mother. I wanted to vent, to tell her everything, to hear her voice and get some sort of comfort. But I knew if I told her, she would no doubt call Sophia immediately, either out of anger or shock, and that would tip Sophia off. I didn't want Sophia to know that I had found out, at least not yet. I needed proof. I needed concrete evidence of her affair so that when the time inevitably came to confront her, I would have everything I needed to end this marriage. I had to be smart. For 2 weeks after that shocking discovery, I channeled all my energy into gathering the evidence I needed to finally confront Sophia and initiate the divorce. During this time, I met with a lawyer to ensure that my assets would be protected as much as possible when the divorce went through. I knew that Sophia and I didn't have a prenuptial agreement, and I wanted to make sure that the fallout from this betrayal didn't leave me in financial ruin. The evening I finally confronted Sophia felt surreal. I sat her down and calmly told her that I knew about her affair. She looked shocked at first, and even tried to argue, to deny what I was saying, but I had come ready for this. One by one, I presented her with all the evidence I had collected over the past month, photos of her with the man, screenshots of their text messages I had collected from her phone, and even records of the days she had lied to me about being at church. With every piece of evidence I revealed, she knew there was no way to talk her way out of this. Finally, begrudgingly, she confessed. She admitted that the man she was seeing was her high school boyfriend, which I had already figured out after doing some research and finding him on Facebook. She tried to downplay the entire affair, saying that she was just being stupid and that she was just fooling around with him, nothing serious. She insisted that she didn't intend for things to go as far as they had. But I wasn't buying it. I looked her in the eyes and firmly told her that I was going to divorce her. She was stunned. I think, in some part of her mind, she believed she could talk her way out of it, that I would somehow forgive her or be swayed by her excuses. But when she realized that I was serious, she tried to fight it. She begged me to reconsider, saying that she could change and we could work things out. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. I knew that if I stayed, I would never be able to trust her again. I calmly told her to pack up her bags and leave. To make sure there would be no confusion or attempts to manipulate the situation with our families, I created a group chat with my parents and Sophia's mother. In the chat, I laid everything out clearly. I sent all the proof of Sophia's infidelity, the photos, the text messages, everything. I wanted them to know the full truth about why I was divorcing her, and I wanted to prevent any false narratives from being spun by either Sophia or her mother. I knew that once the news broke, all hell would break loose, and I wasn't about to leave room for any misunderstandings. As expected, the reactions were intense. My mother was absolutely livid, outraged that Sophia had betrayed me, but at the same time, she and Sophia's mother couldn't help but beg me to reconsider my decision. Despite the undeniable evidence of Sophia's infidelity, they pleaded with me to find it in my heart to forgive her and give her another chance. Thankfully, my dad stood by my side. He reassured me that I was making the right decision, and that no one should stay with a cheating partner, no matter the circumstances. He told me I deserved better and supported my decision to move forward with the divorce. A week after I filed for divorce, Sophia and her mother showed up at my house unexpectedly. Sophia revealed to me that she was pregnant with my child. My immediate reaction was disbelief. I outright refused to accept that I was the father, given her affair. Sophia's mother lashed out at me, accusing me of ruining her daughter's life by not accepting responsibility for the baby and divorcing Sophia so suddenly. She made it seem like I was the one being cruel. Later, my own mother doubled down on her pleas. She talked to me about how children can change everything in a marriage, about how having a baby could bring Sophia and me closer, as if the pregnancy was some magical solution to the infidelity. She told me that Sophia had promised to never cheat again and that I needed to consider the child's future, not just my pride. She made me feel like the bad guy for choosing to walk away from a marriage where the trust was gone. When I still didn't give in to her reasoning, my mother, in her desperation, threatened to testify against me in court when the time came, especially if the issue of child support arose. She said she would make sure I paid for the baby, regardless of whether or not it was mine. DNA doesn't matter, family is family, she argued, implying that she didn't care who the biological father was. She was determined to claim the child as her grandchild, even if it meant going against me in court. And that is exactly what she did. True to her word, my mother testified against me during the divorce proceedings, which was one of the most painful betrayals I've ever experienced. My lawyer and I fought hard to make sure that the court understood that Sophia had been unfaithful and that there was a very real possibility that the child wasn't mine. But my mother and Sophia's mother testified that Sophia's affair wasn't anything sexual, downplaying her infidelity as if it had been some sort of an innocent mistake. They even argued that because Sophia and I had been intimate just weeks before our separation, right around the time I had discovered her affair, the baby must be mine only. Thankfully, in the end, the judge ruled that they couldn't make any final decision regarding child support or paternity until after the baby was born and a proper paternity test needed to be conducted. Only then would it be determined whether or not I was the biological father. I was relieved. It felt like a small victory in what had been a draining and painful process. At least now, I wouldn't be forced into supporting a child that might not be mine without solid proof. But my mother, Sophia, and her mother were furious with the outcome. My mother, later, came up to me and told me how she wished I was not her child and that if I was truly a man then I should pull my pants up and accept Sophia's child as mine, regardless of what the paternity test proves. Over the past months, my mother has gone around bad-mouthing me to everyone in our family, painting me out as the villain who destroyed my marriage over what she insisted was just Sophia's one-time mistake. No matter how much proof I presented or how many logical arguments I made, my mother clung to her narrative, blaming me for everything that had gone wrong. So, you can imagine my satisfaction when the day finally came for the paternity test results. Sophia gave birth to a girl this week, and we promptly had the test done. It turned out that the baby did not belong to me, as expected. When I shared the results with Sophia, she broke down in tears, pleading with me to accept the child. She argued that her friends and family were going to shun her and her daughter if I didn't step up and take responsibility. I felt a deep pit of sympathy for her situation, but it didn't change the fact that I was not the father. "I'm sorry, but I can't do that," I told her firmly. "It's no longer my responsibility." Since then, Sophia has continued to call me and leave me voice messages begging me to reconsider. Ida for not claiming Sophia's baby as mine? Update 1. So, for everyone asking, Sophia is arguing that since I probably won't have kids anytime soon, I should think of this baby as mine, even though she cheated on me. She also revealed that the guy she was having an affair with, her high school sweetheart, has refused to marry her. In fact, he has never been ready to settle down, which is why she had to marry me in the first place. It's clear she wanted to use me as a cash cow while continuing her affair with him. Honestly, I hope she at least takes him to court for child support, but at this point, I just don't care anymore. Update 2. I took everyone's advice and made a post to publicly announce that I am not the father of Sophia's child. I was tired of my mom supporting Sophia after the way she had cheated on me and wanted to humiliate her just the way she had done to me for months on end. Well, guess what? After I made my post calling out my mom for backing Sophia, she called me furious because people had started to turn on her. She accused me of betraying her, which was ironic since she was the one who actually backstabbed me by testifying against me in court and trying to make me pay child support. A lot of my mom's friends and relatives had actually believed her at first, but now, with the paternity test results in, it is clear that my mom was wrong about Sophia. People are calling her out in the comments of my post as well as to her face, telling her she needs to be a better parent to me and how I am the actual victim in this situation. After my mother called to yell at me, she and dad ended up having a huge fight. He was fed up with her constantly bullying me and threatened to leave her if she didn't drop her crazy idea of forcing me to accept Sophia's child, even though it's not mine. Update 3. It's been 5 months since my last update. My parents have decided to separate this past month. This is because my mom has refused to change, and has even started calling herself grandma to Sophia's baby. She's been giving Sophia money every month and even volunteers to babysit her child. It seems like she's finally living out a dream of having a long-lost daughter just like she had always wanted. However, my dad has grown tired of this as he feels this is borderline inappropriate and wants nothing to do with Sophia or her child. This has resulted in multiple fights where my mother has refused to take accountability. As a result, my dad has moved out and has been staying with me. It breaks my heart that my mom is choosing to focus on my cheater ex-wife's daughter over her own family. Anyway, my dad will be talking to a lawyer this week and moving forward with the divorce.